My son said he needed space, that I was cluttering his life. He couldn't even look me in the eye while asking me to move out. So I did, quietly, without a fight. I bought a house 1,000 miles away, where no one asks for less noise. Now, if he wants to apologize, he'll have to fly. And plane tickets are expensive, especially when you've lost everything. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Martha Ellis, and I was 69 years old the year I realized I had become a guest in my own son's home. I had spent the better part of my life working as a librarian in a small Minnesota town where the winters were long, the summers were slow, and everyone knew your name when you went to the grocery store. I liked it that way, quiet, predictable, built around books and the soft rustle of pages and snow. I retired when my knees started aching and my eyes didn't adjust to computer screens the way they used to. My son, Michael, had insisted I move in with him and his family after his promotion moved them to the suburbs of Chicago. I didn't argue. At the time, it seemed like the logical thing to do. They had a large house with too many rooms and not enough time to keep them warm. My room was downstairs, near the laundry, away from the bedrooms and the noise. It wasn't unpleasant, but it always smelled faintly of detergent and old wood. I didn't mind. I didn't need much. A place to sleep, a place to sit, and a place to feel useful. That last part, the usefulness, was what I clung to. I cooked, I cleaned, I folded laundry before anyone noticed it was piling up. I helped with the grandkids when their school schedules clashed with meetings and errands. I never complained, not even when my bones ached or when I was too tired to stand. I didn't do any of it for praise. I did it because that's what mothers do. We stay standing long after everyone else sits down. There was a chair by the window in the dining room. It wasn't a special chair, just a plain wooden one with a faded cushion I had sewn a cover for when I first moved in. But it became my spot, the only place in the house that felt remotely mine. Every morning, I would sit there with a cup of tea while the rest of the house buzzed in chaos. I watched the backyard come to life, watched squirrels dart across the fence, birds hop along the porch rail. It was a quiet pause before the daily movement began. Sometimes I stayed there longer than I should have, sipping tea long gone cold just to stretch the stillness. No one noticed those moments, and I didn't ask them to. It was a small thing, sitting there, but it gave me a sense of presence, as if the world hadn't passed me by completely. But lately, the chair had started to feel like a problem. At first, it was subtle. Someone would move it to vacuum and forget to put it back. A comment about how it blocked the flow of the room. Then it was the way my teacup would disappear from the table before I'd even finished drinking. I began to feel like clutter, something left out that didn't belong. I caught glances between Michael and his wife, Lauren, those short, pinched expressions that were meant to be invisible. But I had raised children. I knew how to read silence. One morning, I overheard Lauren on the phone, laughing to someone about how her house came with a bonus roommate who thinks she's invisible. I stood in the hallway and listened as her voice floated down the stairs, bright and clear. She didn't know I was there, or maybe she did. That day when I sat in my chair by the window, it didn't feel the same. I wrapped my hands around my mug a little tighter. The view hadn't changed. The same trees, the same fence, the same sky. But something in me had. I felt watched, not with affection or even curiosity, with impatience, as if every second I remained there was an intrusion. Michael had always been a kind boy, not overly affectionate, but steady, reliable. As a teenager, he was quiet and bookish, more comfortable with machines and numbers than with people. I never doubted his love, even if he didn't say it out loud. When he invited me to live with them, I believed it came from a place of care. But now I wondered if it had simply been convenience, a solution to a problem that had slowly become a new problem of its own. I thought often about what it meant to take up space, to be present without being seen. I remembered how, as a girl, I used to tuck myself into corners with a book, learning early that quiet was the best way to stay aloud. That lesson had stayed with me. Even now, in this house full of people, I moved like a shadow, soft, careful, nearly invisible. But shadows have weight, too. Eventually, even silence becomes loud. That day, as I sat in the chair by the window, I thought about my own mother, about how she had insisted on living alone until the day she died. She used to say, "If I'm going to be lonely, I'd rather do it in my own home." I never truly understood that until I found myself shrinking in rooms I had cleaned, fading in photos I had taken, disappearing behind the noise of lives I had helped build. My usefulness had become background noise, my presence had become burdensome, and yet no one said it outright. They didn't have to. I looked at the light shifting across the floor, the way it illuminated dust motes hanging in the air. It was a beautiful moment, and no one saw it but me. I finished my tea, stood up slowly, and returned the chair to its place. For now. But something had shifted in me, something quiet but unmovable, like a door gently clicking shut. I didn't know yet where it would lead me, but I knew this. The next time someone asked me to make space, I wouldn't ask which corner to move into. I would find the door and walk through it. It happened on a Thursday. I remember because the trash bins were still lined up at the curb and the house smelled faintly of the curry I had made the night before. The kids were at school, Lauren was upstairs on a video call, and Michael had taken the afternoon off, something he rarely did. I thought maybe he wanted to take me to lunch, or that he needed help with something around the house. I had just finished folding a load of towels and was wiping down the kitchen counters when he called my name from the living room. His voice had that unnatural calm to it, the kind people use when they're about to say something unpleasant and want to mask it with softness. I dried my hands on a dish towel and walked in, already sensing a shift in the air. He didn't sit. He stood near the fireplace, arms crossed loosely, eyes fixed on a spot just over my shoulder. I stood there, waiting, hands at my sides, already knowing that whatever came next wouldn't be kind, no matter how gently it was worded. He said it slowly, as if each word had to be unwrapped from some internal packaging. He talked about boundaries, about space, about how their life had changed since I moved in, and how, maybe, it was time for things to transition again. That word, transition, it struck me as clinical, like he was trying to make the conversation sound like a strategic plan instead of a dismissal. He said he loved me, of course, that he appreciated all I had done, that this wasn't personal. It never is, they say, but it was. It always is. I don't remember responding. I remember the sound of the grandfather clock ticking behind me and the way the sunlight made the dust on the mantel shimmer. I remember the faint scent of lemon polish and how his voice never once cracked. It didn't tremble, didn't pause for breath. It was steady, firm, professional. I wondered if he had practiced in the mirror. I nodded, not in agreement, just acknowledgement. I think that's what he wanted, a silent understanding, something tidy and without mess. I walked back into my room. My knees felt wooden, like they didn't bend the same way. My chest was hollow, as if someone had knocked the wind from me without laying a hand on my body. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. No tears, no shaking, just stillness. That strange, heavy stillness that wraps around you when your world narrows without warning. It was later that night when I opened the closet. The suitcase was still there, tucked behind a stack of old linens and a broken fan. It had been mine since the trip to Vermont years ago, when John was still alive and Michael was just starting college. The zipper was worn and the leather handle cracked, but it still opened with that familiar whisper. I ran my hand over the fabric lining and sat back on my heels. There was no plan, no destination, but the act of pulling the suitcase into the center of the room made something real, tangible. It was the first decision that belonged entirely to me in what felt like years. I started folding my clothes with slow, deliberate care. Not everything, just enough. A few sweaters, my favorite pair of slacks, 2 scarves, a sensible pair of shoes. I didn't rush. I wanted to feel each motion, to honor it. I packed like someone tracing the outline of their own absence. There was a drawer in the nightstand filled with old papers and documents. I thumbed through them, found the folder I had almost forgotten about. The deed to a house I hadn't seen in years. My name still there, printed cleanly at the top. I held it for a moment, letting the weight of it settle into my hands. I placed it gently inside the suitcase. In the bathroom, I packed a small toiletry bag. Just the essentials: a toothbrush, a comb, the lavender lotion I used sparingly to make it last longer. I stared at my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. Not because I looked older, though I did, but because something in my eyes had changed. A quiet resolve had taken root. A knowing. Back in my room, I set the suitcase by the door. I didn't hide it. I didn't need to. He wouldn't ask about it. That was the nature of these things. Once the first line is drawn, everyone pretends not to see the rest. I climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling. The shadows shifted as the moon moved behind the clouds, and I imagined what it would be like to sleep somewhere else, somewhere quiet, where no one tiptoed around me or sighed when I entered a room, somewhere I could breathe without being asked to make space. The suitcase sat silently in the corner, waiting. I knew then that I would leave. I didn't know when or where I would go, but the decision had already been made. He wanted space, and I would give it to him, more than he expected, more than he could fill. The morning after I packed the suitcase, the house felt colder than usual, not in temperature, but in tone. Everything was in its place. Plates stacked neatly in the drying rack, shoes lined up by the door, silence thick in the air. It was the kind of quiet that didn't come from peace, but from avoidance. No one made eye contact. No one asked how I slept. The air around me had changed. I wasn't family anymore. I was a presence to be managed. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the dining room table, my eyes scanning the yard outside the window without really seeing it. A bird hopped across the patio, pecked at something in the cracks of the stone, then flew off. I followed its flight path with my eyes until it vanished past the fence. The freedom of it struck me harder than it should have. After breakfast, I walked to the small grocery store 2 blocks away. I didn't need anything in particular. I just needed to move, to walk in a direction that wasn't dictated by anyone else. The store was mostly empty, just a few quiet shoppers and the soft buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Near the register, tucked into a metal rack next to a rack of dog-eared magazines, I saw it, a fold-out road map of the United States. Paper, not digital, something I could touch. I bought it without thinking, tucking it into my coat like a secret. Back at the house, I unfolded it on the kitchen counter. The creases were stiff and the colors bright. It smelled faintly of ink and dust. I spread it wide, anchoring the corners with salt and pepper shakers and a ceramic sugar jar shaped like a strawberry. I stared at the lines and borders, my eyes scanning the states I hadn't visited in decades, and some I never had. I didn't know what I was looking for yet. I just knew I was done standing still. Minnesota was in the upper left quadrant, my familiar corner of the world. I traced my finger south, then east, then west. I let my mind drift across state lines like a river finding its current. Tennessee, Virginia, New Mexico. The names alone felt like open windows. I remembered a place I had once passed through years ago on a trip with John, a small town in Georgia, quiet, warm, lined with old oak trees. We hadn't stayed long, just a night in a roadside inn on our way to somewhere else. But I remembered the porch swing, the smell of magnolia in the air, and the way the locals nodded at you when you walked by, as if they already knew your name. I circled Georgia on the map with a pen. Later that day, when no one was home, I pinned the map to the side of the refrigerator with two magnets, a ceramic apple and a plastic smiley face, both chipped at the edges. I didn't say anything about it. I wanted it there, visible, unavoidable, a quiet declaration. That evening, when Lauren walked into the kitchen, she looked at the map and blinked. Her mouth opened like she was going to say something, then closed again. She turned and walked out. That was all the conversation we had about it. The map stayed. Every morning I stood in front of it with my tea. I studied routes and back roads, highway numbers, and little dots that marked places too small to matter on most maps. I didn't care about big cities or tourist attractions. I wanted quiet. I wanted a place that wouldn't flinch at the sight of an older woman living alone. I wanted a place where my silence wouldn't be seen as absence, but as presence on her own terms. In the afternoons, I began researching towns online. I looked at housing markets, climate charts, local newspapers. I learned which states had affordable property taxes, which towns had farmers markets, which communities had libraries still open 6 days a week. I was building a life without saying a word. They were busy with their own routines. They didn't ask what I was doing, and I didn't offer it. One afternoon, I pulled down a box from the closet. Inside were old legal folders, documents, and envelopes I hadn't touched in years. At the bottom was the deed to the house, the one Michael and Lauren lived in. My name was printed clearly at the top. I had paid for most of it after John passed. At the time, it had felt like giving my son a gift, a leg up for his young family. It had been easier to leave it in my name for financial reasons. We never revisited the paperwork. I sat with that deed in my lap for a long time, staring at the ink, remembering the day we signed it. Michael had said thank you then. I hadn't seen that version of him in years. I placed the deed on the kitchen counter next to the map. The two objects didn't belong together, not logically, but to me, they were part of the same picture now. One marked the place where I had vanished. The other could lead me to the place I might reappear. Over the next week, I called 3 realtors, one in Georgia, one in North Carolina, one in Arkansas. I asked quiet questions. I took quiet notes. I began folding possibilities into the corners of my day. My suitcase remained packed in the closet, waiting like a thought I hadn't yet spoken aloud. One morning, I made myself breakfast and turned toward the refrigerator. The map was still there, curling at the edges now, worn where my fingers had touched it. It had become a kind of mirror, reflecting back not what I was, but who I might still be if I let myself go far enough to find her. I circled a second town, then a third. The attic had always been the one place in the house no one cared about. No one cleaned it, no one visited it, unless something was lost or needed to be shoved out of sight. In all the years I lived with Michael and his family, I had only been up there twice. Once to help store Christmas decorations, and once to find an old playpen when their second child was born. It was cramped, full of forgotten things, but I liked it. It was honest. Everything up there wore dust without apology. On a cool morning in early spring, I climbed the narrow stairs with a box of my own. The kids were at school, Lauren had gone to the gym, and Michael was on a business trip in Phoenix. The house was quiet in a way that felt temporary, like a held breath. I decided it was the right moment to visit the attic again, this time with different eyes. The wooden stairs creaked beneath my weight, and I had to duck to avoid a low beam at the top. When I opened the door, I was greeted by the thick scent of time. Wood, insulation, something vaguely metallic. Dust motes danced in the thin slats of light that leaked through the small circular window near the roof line. The air was stale but familiar, like an old book long shelved but never forgotten. Boxes were stacked in haphazard towers, labeled with faded marker. Michael, college, Xmas, baby clothes, Misk. I placed my own box down gently near the corner. Inside it were a few things I didn't want to take with me, but couldn't yet part with. A hand-knit shawl my mother had made me before she passed, a bundle of letters John had written in the early years of our marriage, and a photograph of Michael when he was 10, standing next to me with a fishing rod too tall for his body. His face in that photo was open, unguarded. I hadn't seen that expression in years. I sat on an overturned milk crate and let myself breathe in the stillness. The attic had become a waiting room for other people's decisions. Everything here had been cast aside to make room for what came next. I realized with a dull sort of ache that I had become part of that pattern. A body shelved gently, respectfully, but undeniably out of the way. As I looked around, I let my gaze fall on the far corner where a wooden chest sat beneath a faded quilt. I hadn't noticed it before. It wasn't labeled. It didn't belong to me. Out of curiosity, I walked over, lifted the quilt, and brushed away a thick coat of dust from the lid. The brass hinges groaned slightly as I opened it. Inside were layers of memory, a collection of old yearbooks, a broken Polaroid camera, a few bundles of greeting cards tied together with ribbon. Near the bottom, wrapped in an old scarf, was a copy of the mortgage agreement for the house. I didn't expect to find it there. It felt like the kind of thing Michael should have kept in a filing cabinet or a safe, not buried beneath nostalgia. I pulled it out and sat back down. The paper was yellowing at the edges, but intact. My name was still printed on the front page, bold and undeniable. Owner of record. I traced the letters with my thumb. I thought about the long conversations Michael and I had had when he first bought the house, how I offered to help with the down payment, how we agreed, practically temporarily, to put the house in my name until his finances stabilized. We never discussed it again. Time passed. The house became theirs. My name remained. No one had remembered that detail. Or if they had, they assumed it no longer mattered. I folded the document carefully and tucked it into my bag. It felt heavier than it should have, like it carried not just legal weight, but personal history. It was proof that I hadn't imagined my place here, that I hadn't been a ghost, floating around someone else's life, that I had contributed something more than meals and babysitting, something that still existed on paper, even if it had vanished from conversation. I stayed in the attic for over an hour, breathing in the dust, listening to the creaks of the house above and below me. I read old cards that weren't mine, held objects that hadn't been touched in years. There was something oddly comforting about it all. The attic didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. It didn't smile politely while shifting you to the edge of the room. It simply held what was left behind. I found another box that belonged to me, one I had forgotten. Inside were a few paperbacks, a scarf from my first trip to the coast, and a journal I used to keep when I still believed my thoughts were worth recording. I flipped through the pages, reading my own handwriting like the voice of someone I had almost forgotten. I wasn't bitter in those entries. I was alive, curious, present. By the time I descended the stairs again, the sun had shifted across the sky. The house below was still quiet, but it felt different now, like something had shifted, if only inside of me. I walked into the kitchen and looked at the map still pinned to the fridge. Georgia was circled in blue ink. My eyes rested there for a long moment. Then I opened the drawer beside the sink and pulled out a manila envelope. I slid the mortgage document inside and sealed it. I wrote my name in small block letters on the front. I didn't know yet what I would do with it, but I knew it didn't belong in the attic. It belonged with me. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of the cab was the scent. Not the city kind, exhaust, grease, damp pavement, but something softer, more rooted, earth and sun-warmed pine, a faint trace of honeysuckle, even in March, and coffee, strong, rich, dark coffee drifting from somewhere down the street, the kind that told you people brewed it not for speed or convenience, but for company. I had landed the night before, too tired to take in much beyond the clean sheets and stiff pillows of the motel room I'd reserved outside town. I hadn't wanted to book anything more permanent yet. I needed to feel the ground first, needed to see the streets, walk them, breathe in the pace of this place. And that morning, when the sunlight broke through the dusty motel blinds, I knew I was ready to begin. The town was small, older than most, brick buildings with arched windows, wide porches with rocking chairs that looked used, real used, not decorative. There was a post office with a flag that snapped lazily in the breeze, a barber shop with its poles still spinning, and a diner that looked like it hadn't changed its menu in 50 years. I liked it immediately. I walked with my hands in my coat pockets, not because it was cold, but because I needed the comfort of touch, something grounding. The map I had carried with me for weeks was folded in my bag, still marked with my blue circles and penciled notes. This town was one of them. I had picked it almost instinctively, remembering a trip decades ago that had taken me through Georgia, through this region. The memory of quiet streets and thick trees had stayed with me all these years. When I looked it up again, I was relieved to find it hadn't changed much. The coffee smell led me to a corner shop with fogged-up windows and a sign that read, Miss Mabel's. I stepped inside. A bell above the door rang, soft and slow. Inside, the floor creaked beneath my shoes, and the air was thick with warmth. Not just heat, but warmth, the kind you feel in your bones, the kind you miss without knowing. I ordered a cup of black coffee from a woman behind the counter who didn't ask for my name or make small talk. She just poured, slid the cup toward me, and nodded once. I liked her. I liked the silence. I took my coffee to a small table by the window, and I sat. The bitterness hit first, then the depth, then the warmth that bloomed across my chest and into my fingertips. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I tasted something made without rush, without efficiency. I looked out the window and watched the street move slowly. A man walked a dog that looked older than him. Two women leaned against a pickup truck, talking with the kind of rhythm that suggested the conversation had been going for decades. No one looked hurried. No one looked lost. I pulled out the notebook I'd kept folded inside my purse, the same one I'd used when I first began circling towns on the map. I flipped past pages of house listings, notes about local ordinances, climate reports, property taxes. I found the blank page I had saved and wrote the name of the town across the top. Then I closed it again. I stayed in that coffee shop for an hour, maybe more. The sun rose higher. The shadows shifted. I drank slowly, like the cup was a message. And it was. It told me I could stay, that this place didn't mind if I sat a while, that it wouldn't ask me to move along just because my presence no longer served a purpose. When I stepped back outside, the smell of coffee followed me. It clung to my scarf, soaked into my sleeves. I welcomed it. I walked farther into town, past the courthouse with its chipped paint and the school with its weathered playground. A few houses stood for sale, some needing work, others already fixed and staged. I made mental notes. I took down numbers. There was one, though, on a side street that curved slightly uphill, where the trees were older than the power lines and the sidewalk cracked beneath ivy. A white house with green shutters and a crooked porch swing. It wasn't beautiful, not in the way people meant when they said it on television shows. But it was honest. It looked like it had survived things and didn't feel the need to apologize. I stopped and stared at it for a long time. The for sale sign out front was tilted, as if even it had grown tired of standing straight. I wrote the address in my notebook. Later that night, back in the motel, I brewed a cup of tea, but it wasn't the same. It lacked the depth of that morning, the rootedness. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the stack of brochures the realtor had sent me in advance. They were clean and curated, full of manicured lawns and granite countertops. None of them looked like the town I had just walked. None of them smelled like that coffee. I folded them closed and pushed them aside. I opened my laptop and looked up the address of the White House with green shutters. It had been on the market for a while. The listing was simple, a few photos, no staging, just the bones of it, the wood, the rooms, the promise. I sent a message to the agent. Not a commitment, not yet, just a question, just an opening. Then I sat back, let the silence of the motel room wash over me, and imagined myself on that porch swing, holding a warm mug, watching the light shift between trees, a place where no one needed to ask me to leave because I had come by choice, a place where the scent of coffee meant you belonged to the morning. It was the beginning of something, and for once, it was beginning on my terms. It was early evening when my phone rang. I was standing in the kitchen of the little white house with green shutters, barefoot on the old tile floor, the smell of fresh paint still clinging to the walls. The sun had dipped low enough to cast soft light through the lace curtains I had hung that morning. I had just finished unpacking a box labeled Kitchen Fragile, and my hands smelled faintly of newspaper ink and lemon soap. The screen lit up with an unfamiliar number, Atlanta area code. I paused, thumb hovering above the green button. I didn't answer calls from unknown numbers anymore, not out of fear, but out of choice. I had nothing urgent to say, and anyone who really needed me had my address. Or they didn't, and that was fine too. But something about that number made my fingers move. His voice came through before I had a chance to brace myself. It wasn't loud or angry. It was thin, strained at the edges, like someone trying to keep control in a place where control didn't matter anymore. He said my name once, just Mom, and then silence. I heard noise in the background, airport chatter, the tinny echo of a gate announcement, wheels rolling over hard floors. He was calling me from somewhere in transition, nowhere solid. It felt fitting. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't start with, "I'm sorry." He started with disbelief. He had gotten a call from a real estate agent. The house, his house, was being listed for sale. Someone had called his office because they couldn't get through to him. A lawyer had filed the paperwork. He asked me if it was real. I said nothing. He asked again, this time quieter. I could hear his breath, the muffled hum of travelers moving around him. I imagined him standing near a gate, one hand on his hip, phone pressed too close to his face, trying not to attract attention. Maybe he'd just gotten off a plane. Maybe he was about to get on one. It didn't matter. The sound of his voice made time strange. He asked how I could do this, as if he had forgotten everything that had come before. I picked up my tea from the counter and carried it to the window. Outside, the magnolia tree rustled in the breeze. A neighbor's wind chime clinked gently. My chair was still on the porch. The house still smelled new. He said something about the kids, about Lauren, about how I should have talked to him first, that he wasn't prepared for this, that I'd blindsided him. He asked what I wanted, why I was doing this now. He sounded more confused than angry, and beneath it, something else. Panic. Still, I said nothing, because the truth wasn't new. The truth had been sitting quietly in corners for years, folded into the edges of my voice, the pauses after his sentences, the sighs I swallowed. The truth didn't need to be spoken now. It had already been written, on the deed with my name on it, in the note I left when I left the keys on the counter, in the silence I kept every time he reminded me I was staying too long. He said my name again, this time not Mom, just Martha, like he didn't know which version of me he was calling. I finally spoke, my voice low and even. I told him I had done everything properly, that the legal paperwork had been filed, the process was underway, and there were no surprises for anyone who remembered the facts. I told him my name had never been removed, that I had honored every part of the agreement that once felt like family, and that now I was honoring myself. He was quiet. Then he asked where I was. I didn't answer. He said he wanted to see me, that he didn't understand, that we could talk about it. I looked down at the floor, at the box cutter still on the counter, at the light catching the edge of the sink, at the old chipped mug I had found at a thrift shop that now felt more like home than anything in his house ever had. I told him I wasn't ready, that if he wanted to talk, he'd have to come in person. He asked if I meant it. I said yes. I heard him exhale, the long, slow kind that carries the weight of everything not said. Then the line went quiet, not disconnected, just quiet. I stood at the window for a long time after, watching the sky darken. A single star appeared just above the roof line. The magnolia tree shifted again. I wondered if he'd come, if he'd book a ticket, if he'd show up at my new doorstep with questions or regrets or both. I didn't hope for it. I didn't dread it. I simply waited, not for him, but for the next quiet moment, for the night to settle, for the space I had given him and myself to stretch a little farther. The phone never rang again that night, and I didn't need it to. He arrived on a Wednesday. The air was already thick by mid-morning, the kind of southern warmth that clung to your skin and softened the edges of everything. I had spent the early hours watering the front garden, pulling weeds along the walkway, and wiping down the porch swing with a damp cloth. I didn't know if he would come that day, or the next, or at all. I only knew he would come eventually, not out of obligation, out of need, out of something deeper than he was ready to name. The night before, I had heard the ping of an email confirmation, a flight from Chicago Midway to Savannah. One passenger, one way. I didn't reply. I didn't confirm. I didn't need to. That ticket was an answer to a question I had never asked out loud. By noon, I had cleaned the house top to bottom. Not for him, but for me, for the quiet order I had come to love. The kettle was on the stove. The cushions on the porch were fluffed. A single glass sat on the counter beside a half-empty pitcher of sweet tea. There was no nervousness in me, no racing heart, only a strange stillness, like watching the tide come in from a safe distance. When I saw him through the window, standing on the sidewalk, suitcase in hand, blinking in the sunlight, it took a moment to recognize him. He looked different, smaller somehow, or maybe just less certain. His shoulders didn't hold that familiar stiffness. His hands didn't move with the same assurance. There was a tiredness in the way he stood, not from travel, but from the slow erosion of pride. He didn't walk quickly. He paused before opening the gate, his fingers resting on the latch as if unsure whether he should be there. Then he stepped onto the path. The gravel crunched beneath his shoes. The sound felt louder than it should have. I stayed seated in my chair on the porch, watching, waiting. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, looked up at me. I met his gaze and gave a small nod. Not a welcome, not an invitation, just recognition. He climbed the steps slowly and sat in the chair across from mine, the one I'd left empty on purpose. He didn't speak. I didn't offer anything. No hug, no smile, just a glass of tea, which I placed in front of him without a word. He looked down at it like it was some kind of offering from a world he no longer knew how to enter. The minutes stretched between us. He shifted once in his seat, then settled. I could see him taking in the house, the soft hum of the ceiling fan through the open door, the chipped blue paint on the window frames, the neat row of potted herbs along the railing. It was not the home he remembered me in. It was not any home he had known. It was mine. I watched his gaze move to the corner of the porch where my gardening gloves sat, to the swing that still held a faint crease from my morning rest, to the stack of books on the wicker table. My life had shape here. It had rhythm, nothing extravagant, but real, self-made, self-chosen. Finally, he spoke, but I didn't respond, not with words. I sipped my tea and let the silence answer for me. Let it say what I no longer had to explain, that I had built something in the absence of his noise, that I had found steadiness in the space he once claimed to need so badly. He talked a little more about work, about the kids, about how strange it was not to have me there. He asked if I was happy. I didn't nod. I didn't say yes. I just looked out across the yard and watched a dragonfly skim the surface of the bird bath. He asked if I'd come back, visit, spend time. I turned to him then, really looked at him, and I said what I had been holding for weeks. He had asked for space. I had given it, not the kind that comes in square footage or quiet hallways, the kind that redraws the edges of a life. He stared at the porch boards after that, didn't say much else. He stayed for a while, maybe an hour, maybe more. We sat through most of it in silence, the air thick with what wasn't being said. Then he stood, lifted his suitcase, and paused at the steps again. I didn't stand. I didn't walk him out. He didn't ask to stay the night. He didn't ask what time the return flight left, because we both knew he hadn't booked one. That night, I made dinner the way I always did. Nothing special. Just what I had planned. Baked chicken with rosemary, roasted sweet potatoes, and collard greens with garlic. A meal built from simple habits and steady hands. I didn't change the portions. I didn't set an extra place with ceremony. I moved through the motions of cooking the same way I had every evening since I moved into the house. Slow, intentional, mine. He was still sitting on the porch when I brought the food out. The light was thinning, dipping behind the trees, casting long blue shadows across the floorboards. The glass of tea I had given him earlier was empty, his fingers resting lightly on the rim. He didn't look up when I stepped through the door. He just kept staring into the darkening yard, like he was trying to memorize the lines of a place he knew he didn't belong to. I placed one plate in front of him. No invitation, no explanation, just food. A gesture, a line drawn with kindness, not forgiveness. I carried my own plate to the other side of the porch and sat where I always sat, on the chair near the small table with the herb pots, closest to the wall, facing the yard. I ate in silence, each bite steady, each chew deliberate, the kind of silence that didn't ask questions or offer comfort. It simply made space. I didn't watch him eat, but I knew he did, slowly, hesitantly at first, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to, then with more certainty, like his hunger caught up with his pride. I heard the clink of his fork against the ceramic. I noticed the way the chair creaked when he leaned forward to cut his food, the familiar sounds of someone trying to occupy space as quietly as possible. It reminded me of myself. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. There are silences that feel like walls and others that feel like bridges. This one was neither. It was a hallway between two doors, both of them closed. I remembered the meals I had made for him when he was young, how he used to swing his legs under the table, asking endless questions, making faces at his vegetables, always insisting on a second piece of cornbread. I remembered the dinners later when he was older, quieter, already slipping into someone I didn't recognize, lost in a world of deadlines and schedules and rules about efficiency and noise control. This meal was different. It wasn't shared the way meals are in families. It was something else. An offering, perhaps. A reminder, not of the past, but of what could be tolerated in the present. When we finished, I stood and picked up my plate. I left his where it was. I didn't clear it for him. I walked inside, washed mine in the sink, dried it, and placed it back on the rack. I folded the towel slowly, smoothing the fabric before draping it neatly over the handle of the oven. I made tea for myself, 1 cup, and sat at the kitchen table with the lights off, the soft sound of the crickets outside my only company. I could hear the screen door creak open behind me and the familiar drag of his shoes as he walked into the kitchen. He stood for a long time without saying a word. I didn't turn to look. I kept stirring my tea, letting the spoon tap lightly against the sides of the mug. Eventually, I heard the scrape of his plate being picked up, the soft sound of water running, the click of the faucet turning off, then footsteps retreating, the door shutting again. I sat there long after the tea had gone cold. In the silence that wrapped around me, I found no sorrow, no triumph, just clarity. He wasn't here to fix anything, and I hadn't cooked him dinner to help him try. He was here to see what my life looked like without him at the center of it, to see what I had built in the quiet space he left behind. A porch, a plate, a place at the table that was offered, not owed. And in that silence between us, I understood something that I hadn't before. I wasn't waiting to be asked back. I was showing him I had already arrived. The next morning unfolded slowly, as if the world itself was unsure how to follow the quiet that had settled over the house. Pale sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, drawing long golden lines across the hardwood floor. I stood barefoot in the kitchen, the coolness of the tile reminding me I was still grounded, still present. The kettle let out a soft hiss, and I poured my coffee with both hands, careful not to spill. Every motion had weight now, intention. Outside, the garden swayed with the breeze. The magnolia tree cast moving shadows on the front path, and the birds gathered at the feeder, chirping in their unhurried language. It was a morning that asked for nothing, a morning that felt untouched by the previous day's tension. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around myself and walked to the porch with my mug, steam rising into the cool air like breath held and finally released. I had been up since just after dawn, long before he stirred upstairs, long before the house creaked with life. I moved in silence through the guest room, gathering his belongings. I folded his shirts with the same precision I used for my own linens, smoothing the sleeves, pressing the fabric flat. I rolled his socks into neat pairs and placed them into the corners of the suitcase. I tucked his wallet into the side pocket, along with the charger I knew he would forget. On top, I laid the printed boarding pass, torn from the email I found open on his phone, not out of invasion, but because he hadn't planned far enough ahead to print it himself. I placed the suitcase on the porch beside the wicker table. His jacket, the one he never wore but always carried, I folded and draped over the arm of the chair. His shoes, dusty from our walk to the edge of town the day before, I set side by side beneath the swing. It looked almost domestic, the way the items rested there, like a man who had gone inside briefly and would return at any moment. But I knew he wouldn't. Not again. Not in the same way. When I sat down with my coffee, I let the heat of the mug sink into my palms. The porch wood was damp from the morning dew, and the cushions chilled through the fabric of my robe. I didn't shift. I didn't brace myself. I just listened to the birds, to the wind, to the gentle weight of a life uninterrupted. It was nearly an hour before I heard the floorboards above creak, then the faint sound of water running, the muffled closing of a drawer. The quiet had shape now. I recognized his steps even though they were different, slower, heavier. He didn't know how to walk in a house that was no longer his. The front door creaked open like it always did, and he stepped out, blinking against the light. He saw the suitcase first, then the folded jacket, then the shoes. He looked down at them, then up at me. I didn't move. I didn't speak. There was no script for this moment. He stood with the door half open behind him, as though unsure whether to go back inside or come forward. The screen pressed lightly against his back, squeaking in protest. I watched him glance to the left, toward the swing where we had sat once, years ago, when he had still called me on his own terms, when silence between us was easy. He didn't ask why I had packed for him. He didn't ask where the taxi would pick him up. He didn't ask anything at all. Instead, he stepped forward and sat down slowly on the top step of the porch. His hands dangled between his knees, knuckles pale, and he stared out at the street like it was a place he'd never seen before. He whispered that he hadn't expected to feel like a visitor, that this hadn't felt like an ending. Not until now. I heard him, but I didn't respond, because it wasn't an ending. It was a correction. It was me claiming the quiet he had asked for, but never respected when I gave it to him. He sighed deeply, like someone surrendering, not to me, but to the truth that had finally become louder than denial. He stood, adjusted the strap of the bag over his shoulder, and paused. I saw the question in his eyes, a hope for softness, an instinct that I would reach out, offer something to ease the ache. I didn't, not out of cruelty, but because I had nothing left to carry for him. At the bottom of the steps, he turned to look at me one last time. Our eyes met, not as mother and son, but as two people who now understood that distance could sometimes preserve love better than proximity ever could. I nodded, a simple acknowledgement, nothing more. He nodded back, and then he walked down the path, one step at a time, each one erasing a version of us that no longer fit. The gate clicked shut behind him. The gravel quieted. The wind stirred the trees. I remained on the porch, letting the silence settle again around me. The same silence he once asked for, now fully and completely his. And in that stillness I smiled, not with triumph, but with relief. Because for the first time, I had made a decision that required no permission. And I had made space, not for his return, but for my own life. A life that didn't begin with his footsteps. A life that would no longer pause at his shadow. A life that finally I didn't need to explain. I finished my coffee, then I went inside. The day was just beginning, and this time it was mine, entirely mine. That evening, after the sun had slipped behind the trees and the sky turned the color of bruised lavender, I stood barefoot on the porch with a cup of tea cradled in both hands. The porch light above hummed faintly, casting a soft golden halo over the steps, and the scent of fresh soil drifted in from the garden beds I had turned earlier that week. The chair beside mine was empty. His bag was gone. The gravel path was undisturbed, and for the first time in a long time, my breath moved freely through my chest. Inside, the house was still warm from the oven. I had baked a small peach cobbler after he left, not because I had planned to, but because the fruit was ripe and the silence invited sweetness. I had played the radio softly in the background while I stirred and folded and dusted sugar across the top. A song from decades ago had come on, a melody I once danced to in the kitchen with my son wrapped around my hip, when his legs were still too short to reach the floor. I let it play and didn't look away from the memory. When the cobbler cooled, I cut a slice and left the rest covered on the stove. I carried my plate out to the porch and watched the day end in pieces, the last of the light slipping through the trees, the shadows stretching across the lawn, the moths fluttering under the porch bulb like fragile thoughts with wings. I sat there a long time, the cobbler cooling on my lap, uneaten, not because I wasn't hungry, but because I was full in another way. Full of the quiet I had fought so long to find, full of the stillness that didn't require me to shrink, full of the calm that came when you finally stopped asking to belong and simply started living like you already did. There was no voice calling me from another room, no footsteps circling the kitchen in quiet frustration, no strained smiles or cold sighs or words layered in meaning. Just the creak of the swing beneath me and the hush of the night sliding over the world like a quilt. I thought about how many years I had spent adjusting myself to fit, how many times I had let myself be softened at the edges so others could feel comfortable, how often I had said, "I understand," even when I didn't, even when I shouldn't have, the habit of making space for others while slowly erasing myself. But here, no one asked me to step aside. No one made a face when I lingered in a room too long. No one turned my quiet into burden. This house didn't ask for permission to hold me. It simply did, in its creaky floors and slightly crooked windows, in the way the walls carried the smell of baked things for hours, in the rusted hinges that didn't mind opening slowly. I fit here, not because I was small enough, but because I had finally made a life that didn't require me to be anything but fully whole. I took a slow bite of cobbler. The sweetness bloomed on my tongue, warm and sharp. And then, through the trees, I saw the glow of another porch light turning on across the street. The shape of someone stepping out. It was him, Walter. We'd met a few weeks ago at the community garden. He had complimented my tomatoes, asked if I knew anything about cucumbers, then shyly admitted he just liked talking while his coffee cooled. He was tall, with silver at his temples and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. A widower, quiet like me, gentle in the way that made you feel safe just standing near him. We had begun sharing benches, then sandwiches, then stories. Nothing serious, just two people orbiting each other gently, like planets with overlapping paths. Sometimes he would wave from his porch, and I would wave back. Once, he brought me a cutting from his rosemary bush and didn't ask for anything in return. That night, he saw me on the swing and lifted a hand. I raised mine in reply. And just like that, there was something new in the evening air. Not noise, not demand, but the soft flicker of possibility. He didn't walk over. I didn't invite him. But there was a promise in the silence between us. A shared understanding that not all connections need to come with questions or expectations. Some just arrive like dusk, slow and certain, brushing your shoulder without asking for permission. I leaned back in the swing, letting it move gently. The porch light flickered once, then held steady. The trees whispered to each other in the breeze. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for someone to prove I belonged. Because I had built this life. Because I had chosen it. And because, finally, I had met someone who didn't ask me to disappear to make room for him. Someone who understood that quiet wasn't absence, that stillness wasn't lack, that being alone and being lonely were never the same. This was not revenge. This was not a message sent. This was a new beginning. I finished my tea, closed my eyes, and smiled, because this was my home, a place where no one asked me to leave, and someone had finally arrived, not to take anything, but to sit beside what already was, including me.